quite a bit
50.
today.
I just did a piece on that yesterday. MIT filmed me. I'm going to get all kinds of fans in my LinkedIn's and YouTube's off of that one. So
Yay.
all kinds of Elon fans. I'll be very popular with them. So.
I trust you had some significant non-full-time in office perspective, or maybe some
more data driven perspective on it. And also just like, this is the smallest thing you could be focused on. If your objective is efficiency, it's like government workers are, roughly speaking, 1.8% of the federal budget. 70% of that is civilian, military, or homeland security. So they're off the board. So you're left with 30%. Half of them are in the office full time because they have to be. So that's off the board. So you're down to 15%. Of that, 80% of them are in the office 3 days a week, which is better than the private sector does. And by the way, this whole thing has pushed the federal agencies to get more clear about what performance standards are, regardless of where you sit. And it's helped them hire people in more locations closer to their constituents, which is actually cheaper and more efficient. But other than that, clearly this is not an efficiency play. So
I'm excited to see that.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
For everybody that's joining, we're going to give one more minute before we get started, just so folks have a chance to settle in, and then we'll get kicked off.
Good afternoon, Henrik.
Interesting enough, the British government is doing the reverse.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, this is like a perennial topic right now about the US federal government. The British government has said they're supporting work from home.
Yeah.
To improve efficiency.
Yeah.
So it's like the precise, well, their view, which I align with more, that it makes civil servants more productive, allowing them to work from home 2-3 days a week, and it eases recruitment and retention. So precisely, it's like 180 degrees opposite.
Wow. What triggered that?
Yeah.
So what?
Your research.
Yeah, well, exactly. As Brian was saying,
it's the Nick Bloom effect. That's what it is.
It's all
no. I haven't been in contact. Well, it's Keir Starmer's our prime minister, who's centrist, really.
Yeah. It's logic driven, but other than that,
Yeah, but it's government, so no, sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Politicians and logic don't always get along. That's always my favorite. Like, what we need is more politicians making more decisions because people trust them. Like, come on. The lowest form of trust falls into the laps of politicians.
All right. Well, I think we're probably, looks like a good chunk of people already joined. It's 4 minutes past. And so, and just before we get started actually with the slides, I want to give a quick housekeeping and then we'll kind of flash things back up. But first of all, thank you everybody for joining us for this December webinar. I know this is a crazy time between Thanksgiving and the holidays. Everyone tries to get a wrap on 2024 and get started with 2025 the right way. So thanks for spending a little bit of time with us. I am honored to be able to spend time with these three folks in particular, Brian, Debbie, and Nick, who are just incredibly thoughtful and knowledgeable around this topic in the field and how things are evolving when it comes to all things work, flexible work, future of work, making work, lots of different permutations of this. And so first of all, Brian, Nick, Debbie, thank you so much for joining me.
Always glad to do it.
A couple very quick housekeeping items, and then we'll get into presentation. The way that this works from a format perspective is each of us have put together roughly 5, maybe 6 slides of the latest and greatest of things that we're thinking about, insights on how work is evolving from a policy perspective, how we think about it related to AI, how we think about impact on employees. And so we will each spend roughly 5 to 7 minutes talking. We'll do it in rapid fire succession. The goal is to be done with that by about 1/2 past. And that way we spend the entire second half of the webinar purely in Q&A. So in order to facilitate that Q&A, we do a couple things. One, there's a Q&A button. If you look at the bottom of the Zoom screen, go ahead and type in whatever questions you have at any point along the way. We'll either try and answer them in flow if it's something related to what we're talking about at that moment, or we'll save it for the end and we'll try and cover as many of those questions as possible. No bad questions. Please feel free to put in whatever's on your mind. I believe you can also thumbs up other people's questions, and please go ahead and do that if somebody asks something that you think is particularly interesting, because that way we can prioritize a little bit based on what everybody's thinking about or what seems most interesting to the group. Otherwise, there's a chat, which I see people are already making good use of. Feel free to put in your own thoughts in the chat, answer people's thoughts in chat. One of the most fun things in past webinars, and this is actually the 6th time we've done this, so we've got pretty good experience in seeing what's worked and what hasn't worked, is often we'll be discussing something live, and at the same time, there'll be another vibrant conversation happening in the chat about something else at the same time, and I love that. So please feel free to jump in with whatever's on your mind and respond to others, and we can have good discussion there. And then otherwise, last couple things to note, this is recorded. And so for folks that want to be able to access this afterward or weren't able to join us, we'll send it out in the newsletter with a link so people can access the webinar. We'll also send a link to the slides in case people want them afterward. So you'll be able to access all the material. Brian, Nick, Debbie, did I miss anything on our housekeeping upfront setup? No? Okay. All right. We will dig into presentations. All right, so if you move to the next slide, just very briefly on me, if you haven't joined us before, I'm the CEO and co-founder at FlexIndex. FlexIndex is the leading insight and data platform on how companies approach flexible work and policy. So we have flexible work policy information on 13,000 plus companies. They collectively have more than 120,000 offices. They employ more than 120 million people globally. So it's a pretty robust data set. We offer a number of products off the back of that, which is things like a Flex GPT, so you can query the database and get your own trends and insights pulled out of it. You can benchmark your policy and real estate holdings relative to peers with similar policies. All of that you can find on our site at flexindex.com. So if you go to the next page, earlier this week, we released our most recent quarterly report, and we've been tracking policy information both globally, but also particularly in the US since the beginning of 2023. So we now have about 8 quarters of data on how policy has evolved. One thing that was really interesting to see, and what you're looking at in this chart is quarter by quarter, what's the percentage of companies in the US on an industry-weighted basis that are either requiring full-time in office for corporate employees or offer any level of work location flexibility, whether that means fully remote, hybrid, employee's choice, whatever the actual variant is, some level of work location flexibility. In the past few months, it's been pretty interesting because we've seen big announcements from Amazon and from Dell and Washington Post, and a number of companies around returning full-time in office. And so we were curious to see if full-time in office started to really move in our data set. Is that picking up more broadly? Interestingly enough, not yet. Right, as of Q3 2024, 67% of companies, so about 2/3 of companies, offered some degree of work location flexibility. 1/3 were full-time in office. If you look at this most recent quarter, 68% offer work location flexibility, 32% are full-time in office. So you can think of it as effectively flat over the last 3 quarters, even with some high-profile moves toward full-time in office over that period. At the same time, if you go a slide further, when you go and kind of click one level beneath the hood, if you will, there's actually some pretty meaningful change happening beneath the surface. And so if you look at the composition of that flexible group, so the group that 68% of firms that offer some degree of flexibility, fully flexible, meaning the firms that either are fully remote and have no offices at all, or have offices but give employees choice and make it so that employees can go in as often or as little as they want, that set of models has actually decreased quite a bit recently. In Q1 2023, about 31% of US firms were fully flexible. In this most recent quarter, 25% of firms were fully flexible. At the same time, the big grower, and this has been consistent every quarter since we started tracking, is structured hybrid. Structured hybrid means that the company sets a specific expectation on how much time is spent in the office. It's not full-time, but there's some specific expectation. It could be minimum days a week, it could be specific days a week, it could be a minimum percentage of time, but the company sets some guardrails on it. That was 20% of firms back in Q1 2023. Now it's all the way up to 43% firms. So big changes here in terms of the way that flexibility is being instrumented at the firm level. If you jump forward one more slide, this gives a more specific breakdown so you can understand what each policy type looks like within the 100% composite of the US. So within that fully flexible, about 5% of firms are fully remote, 20% are employee's choice. So most of the firms that offer full flexibility actually still have offices. The percentage of firms that are fully remote has been pretty consistent over the last 7-8 quarters. It actually dropped a little bit, I think from 7% to roughly 5% maybe over the last quarter or two. By far the most common policy and increasingly common each quarter is minimum days a week. And that means in particular that the company sets a specific number of days, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, that they expect corporate employees to be in. But then they allow departments or teams to kind of find themselves within that policy. So one team might say any employee can choose which 3 days a week. Another team might say we're going to do Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, right? But it's kind of left up to a smaller group, if you will, within the company to kind of figure out how that gets instrumented within a broader policy. Sometimes I think about that as like bowling with bumper rails, where it's like the company is setting bumper rails in terms of what the policy is, and each team can kind of figure out where down the lane they want to bowl, but the company sets kind of like the guardrails around it. Minimum days a week is by far, I think, the most common policies. You can see only 4% are specific days a week, 3% are minimum percentage of time, and 1% is min and specific days, which means company says something like everyone is required to come in 3 days a week, and one of those days has to be Tuesday. And then, as we talked about in the previous slide, 32% of firms require full-time in office. Jumping forward one more, one of the big shifts we saw, especially over the last couple of quarters, is what's the average US firm requiring in terms of days per week in office? And the way we do this analysis is we take each policy type and the specific details of that policy and translate it into how many days a week are required effectively by that company. So if you're fully flexible and there's no time in the office required, it's counted as 0. If you require full-time in office, it's counted as 5. If you have a minimum days a week policy and it's 2 days, it's counted as 2. And that way we can kind of understand what the distribution looks like across the US. In Q4, the average has now climbed up to 2.78 days per week in office, which means that most employees on average, you would say, are probably spending about 3 days a week. And then some people are spending 2 days a week. What's interesting about it is it's pretty polarized, right? So you still have a pretty big group that's either 0 or 5. 57% of employees have no requirement or full-time requirement, but 3 days a week has grown quite a bit over time in popularity. I think 2 quarters ago, it was less than 20% of firms required 3 days a week. Now it's 28% of firms require 3 days a week. As a result, the average has climbed up. Last quarter, I think the average is about 0.15 days less than this. It was closer to 2.63, 2.64. Now it's 2.78. So while full-time in office itself isn't growing meaningfully yet as a percentage of the pie, the amount of time in office is certainly climbing up. And we've seen that happen the last couple of quarters. Last thing I'll share, and this has been consistently true, is there's a huge difference in policy implementation and choice by company size. And really the dividing line is 500 employees. For less than 500 employee companies, they're actually overwhelmingly fully flexible. Most of them giving employees choice of when and how often to kind of go into the office, with a small group being structured hybrid and a small group being full-time in office. If you compare that to the larger group, 25,000 plus employees, overwhelmingly structured hybrid, right? With a small group that's fully flexible and a small group that's full-time in office. Increasingly, the 500 to 5,000, 5,000 to 25,000, 25,000 plus, they're becoming more and more similar over time. In some ways, like the difference between these groups, if I were to show this chart versus what it looked like a year ago, is actually becoming more compressed. They look more and more alike, but the less than 500 continues to look quite different. So it raised an interesting question in the future. Will we continue to be down that path where small companies will be more flexible and feel like they have to put more structure as they get bigger? Or will smaller companies start putting more structure in place, seeing all the larger companies do it? I think that's one of the big open questions still that we're going to learn more about over the coming years. And with that, I will pass it over to Nick.
Thanks very much, Rob. Great. So, and next slide, thanks. So I thought, given how topical this thing still is, the return to office announcement never seems to die. It's like one of those horror movies where you think the creature's dead, and then suddenly it jumps out from the kitchen half alive and reattacks you. So I thought what I would do is just go through 2 studies, the best studies that I know right now on return to office, and just summarize them for everyone. They were both presented in the remote work conference that was held in Stanford about a couple of months ago. And I'll put the link to that in the chat afterwards as a video recording, but I'll give you the quick summary of them now. I also put an even quicker summary actually out on LinkedIn, so this is a kind of an extended version. So study 1 is by Sean Flynn, Andrew Gent, and Vasudha Nair. And what they do is they look at the Russell 3000 firms. So these are basically every public listed firm you've ever heard of. These are the largest 3,000 firms. So pretty much anyone that is public, which is pretty much most all US companies are on this list. and they looked at return to office announcements from basically the beginning of the pandemic through to mid last year, mid 2023. And they used two sources for this. One is Factiva, so a lot of painful searching, looking for RTO news index, news sources reading. So this is kind of very hand-based collection mechanism. Secondly, they used this fantastic data set called the Flex Index that some of you may have heard of. So collectively, they used these two, and they picked up almost 1,300 announcements. So on the right, you can see what these RTO announcements are. Very consistent with Rob, actually. 60% of them are to hybrid. So, people have in mind that they're all like full 5-day return to office. That's the scare story. But you see 60% are to hybrid. Only 10% of the Amazon or the Musk, Ramaswamy type apparently full return to office. So 60% hybrid. Then there's a mix of others. Next slide, thanks. So what do these guys find? Well, this study finds three results. One is, perhaps unsurprisingly, firms' headquarters in cities with more expensive office space allow more remote work. So as you can guess, if your headquarters in San Francisco, New York, Chicago, DC, which has a lot of expensive space, you allow folks to work from home. Secondly, consistent actually with what Rob just showed, smaller, younger firms allow more remote work. The smaller is exactly as he showed on his flex data. Younger I'll come back to, but I think it relates to fact 3, that younger firms tend to also be headed by younger CEOs, and they tend to be more relaxed about working from home. So fact 3 is firms headed by women and or younger CEOs allow more remote work. That's study 1. Nothing about performance, but you're getting the sense that working from home is about saving office space, is about new, younger firms, and tends to be new, younger, more female CEOs. Okay, next slide, thanks. So the second presentation, the second paper is from a pair at Pittsburgh, Yue Ding and Mark Ma. And go next slide, thanks. So again, that was presented at our remote work conference. Again, you can see there's a 20-minute YouTube video of the presentation. This is their slide. So I'm I to remain faithful to the original presentation. This is their discussion. So they take the S&P 500. So this is really 500 of the biggest firms you looked at before. Again, probably most firms you've heard of in the S&P 500. And they then carefully comb through. They go up to mid-2024 of all the RTO announcements. They find 137. So what do they find? Next slide, thanks. So they find 4 things. First, pretty interestingly, bad performance leads firms to make RTO announcements. So when firms' stock performance or accounting performance is getting worse, they're more likely to announce it. In the conference and in many discussions with execs in the paper, they say, look, there's at least 2 different stories for this. One is that, look, things are going wrong, and the CEO thinks that maybe calling folks back into the office is going to help turn it around. Second story is the CEO is looking for an excuse. So, I'm CEO Nick or Debbie or whoever, and things are going badly wrong, and I decide, normally I blame the weather or unions or bad luck. Right now I'm blaming these work from home workers, and maybe it gets me another 6 months. So that's fact 1. Fact 2 is there's no impact on performance after the RTO announcement. So it doesn't make things better, doesn't make things worse. You're about flat. So, stock performance doesn't really shift much. Accounting earnings don't really change much. So you can kind of read it either way. But net, there's no impact on performance. Fact 3, though, there's definitely a big negative impact on employee ratings. So employees are, not surprisingly, extremely upset. I just saw Mark March has a follow-on paper just coming out right now showing there's a very high turnover rate on LinkedIn. So you can see quite clearly that after this happens, not only are they upset on Glassdoor employee ratings, but people quit, particularly senior, more experienced employees, particularly female employees, are much more likely to leave the firm after this happens. And then fact 4, which I think is most related to the Elon Musk push, is older male, more powerful CEOs are more likely to call a return to office. And if you're wondering how they measure CEO power, they compare the salary of the CEO to the other 4 board members, the other 4 execs that are listed on the proxy statement that has exec pay. So what is going on here? There's various interpretations. One interpretation is, look, if you're Elon Musk, you're mid-50s, you've had a very successful career to make it to be a CEO of one of these firms, and you just self-extrapolate. You think, look, my career has been great. I've been mostly in person, and you kind of force that on the rest of your company. I don't honestly think that's a good idea. If you look at results 2 and 3, it suggests that's probably bad policy. But that, I think, is what's ultimately driving a lot of it. It's either politics, as is the case of the US federal government. We noted before the call, actually, the British government has said they're allowing civil servants to work from home to save money and increase efficiency, the exact opposite of what Musk and Ramaswamy are claiming. But anyway, my take is I suspect more of this is ultimately driven by personality. And with that, I will go quiet.
My turn. Hey, y'all. I'm Brian Elliott, CEO of Work Forward. Ran Future Forum, co-authored a book that's fantastic behind me on the shelf. Let's keep on going and move through this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the parallels that I'm seeing between adoption of workplace flexibility and generative AI. These are the two sort of huge topics these days when you talk about future of work. But there's this sort of surprisingly similar set of things that are happening right now in terms of the slowdown in adoption of both of these. So workplace flexibility has basically stabilized, as Rob just showed, around 2/3 of firms that has some form of workplace flexibility, about 1/3 that don't. It's kind of similar to the number of people who aren't using generative AI at work. So the chart on the right-hand side is Slack data they just put out about a month ago. They tracked 17,000 workers around the globe, 10,000 in the US over the course of the past couple of years. The bottom of the chart is their generative AI usage, which grew pretty steadily over the course of the past year and then has slowed down in the past few months and sits today at about 32-33% of workers. Very similar to what Gallup just put out in the same month, saying 2/3 of workers have basically never used it at work. What's more interesting is the level of excitement around the opportunity for Gen AI to make your job better is plummeting kind of like a rock, going from 46% in the US in the spring of this year to a healthily down 36%. And there's that similarity in terms of the slowdown and adoption of these, I think, is underlying a couple of key challenges. So, Michael, the next page. The challenges that I'm seeing in both of these is sort of 4 things. One, too many firms are taking a command and control type of approach. We're using both return to office and generative AI as a stick to drive up efficiency. So whether you call it return to work and we want people back in the office because we think that makes them more productive, or the drive is we want people to be more efficient in their jobs and so use the tools to do it. Upwork had a study earlier this summer saying 85% of execs have mandated the use of AI in their workplace to become more efficient. When people hear that, by the way, what they hear is maybe I'm losing my job. So we'll get back into the trust issue in a minute. Second big thing is tech tools don't change how we work. I've been in this business for 25 years. Handing people a tool doesn't change the nature of how the work gets done. Giving people Zoom means that you're going to have a lot of 30-minute meetings on your calendar because the default to 30 minutes in your calendar and the presence of a video call in a distributed team means that becomes the hammer for all problems. Giving them access to a generalized LLM and stuffing it over here on the side, or maybe one that's not quite as good, shoved into a Copilot product, doesn't mean they actually change their workflows and look at how work gets done to make it more efficient. Third, and this is probably the bigger one, if almost every executive out there is worried about this, they're not investing the time in training and support for their people and their individuals. The numbers are shockingly similar on this one. 25% of managers have been trained to lead hybrid teams. That came out of some work that Kate Lister did earlier this year. 26% of employees have been trained on generative AI tools. If you expect people to use this stuff, you might want to give them some support and time to do so. And the last one, and maybe the biggest one, is these are both emotional reactions. Nick's study in Nature that got published earlier this summer talked about the fact that when managers in the firm that he worked with moved from being primarily in office to managing hybrid, beforehand, they all believed that people would be less productive working from home. It took the experience of managing people for them to trust their employees and see that it worked. And then they flipped literally from we don't think it's going to work to we think this is better. Same thing is true when it comes to generative AI. Slack's data is fascinating around this stuff. This is an emotional reaction, right? 47% of people think that using Gen AI is cheating. 46% of them feel like they're less competent, not to mention the fears of potentially losing your job if you actually do become more efficient. So what do you do about this? Next page. Both of these have some similar frameworks, but one thing that sits at the center of this is everything that changes in the way that we work requires investment up front. This is the J curve. It's this curve that's been used for decades around adoption of new technologies and new ways of working that says you don't get the payoff in productivity gains without paying a price up front of lower productivity and lower performance for some period of time while you figure out what's going on. So if what you're saying to your teams is, we want you to figure out how to be good at managing, distributed teams, but we're not going to give you time and coaching and support for doing it, it's not surprising they're not going to get good at it. If you're saying to your teams, we want you to adopt generative AI skills and capabilities, but we're not letting go of this quarter's goals or next quarter's goals or the quarter's goals after that, you still have to hit all of that. You're not going to get the time and energy it takes to actually rethink business processes and how you make it work. So, next slide. There are frameworks that work for all of this. This is the stuff that I've been saying we've been seeing from a workplace flexibility perspective for the past 4 years, almost 5, that also I think works really well when you think about generative AI. Number one, organizations need guidelines, not policies. Guidelines are things like it's okay to use generative AI tools at work for composing email out to our customers, but we expect there to be a human in the middle of it. By the way, we expect you to use the tools that we approved and have given to you. Guidelines are things like we expect every team to get together at least once a quarter and we'll fund you to do that. Second is outcomes orientation. We're not going to judge you on the basis of efficiency or activity or how many emails you generate or how many times you show up in the office. We're going to judge you on the basis of the results you create. So therefore, use your flexibility, use these new tools to generate results for the business and you'll get rewarded. Third is teams need to talk about norms, what their norms are for both how they work flexibly, but also their norms for adopting these tools. And I'll get back to that in 1 second. And you need to give them space and time for experimentation, which is how you build a learning organization in the first place. All of these things, guidelines, outcomes orientation, talking about it as a team and developing norms, experimentation, are really about building trust. Trust in executives that they can give people latitude because they're going to be focused on results, and trust in employees that their jobs aren't being replaced. Next page. This is a great example from the Slack team on some of the work they did. This came out of a researcher who worked with them over the course of the summer, talking with a lot of people about why do you use or not use generative AI. And one of the things that came out of it really clearly is, I haven't had this conversation with my team. I'm not sure if my way of thinking about this is their way of thinking about this. What's acceptable use in our workplace? It's kind of like that Google Olympics commercial that we all saw where the AI was being used to write the letter for the kid that was going out to his favorite Olympic athlete. And everybody went, ew, cringe. That's not where we want this to be used. Having that conversation as a team opens up the conversation to be able to talk about what works, what doesn't, what's acceptable and what's not, and allows you to build trust and safety in using these tools as much as it does with flexibility. Last page from me. All these companies that are investing in flexible ways of working also happen to be the ones that are applying a lot of these principles, and I think are also going to be the ones we're going to look at a year or two from now and say they're also the ones that are leveraging Gen AI the most. If you're thinking about this from a perspective of how you build trust in your employees, how you're results oriented, I loved the Synchrony CEO's piece in Fortune the other day. Like, these are all about firms that are thinking about, how do I become outcomes oriented? How do I build trust in my teams? How do I give them the tools they need to be successful? And how do I actually create room for experimentation and learning as we go along? Teams that are figuring out workplace flexibility are going to be the teams that figure out how to actually leverage Gen AI productively. And they're the ones that are going to win, and they'll be our winners 5 years from now. Next up, Debbie.
All right, I love the order you put us in. Rob, that was brilliant. We were changing my title on this. So my 6th time here, love talking with these guys. I'm like taking notes and learning as you go. I started leading BCG's thinking on the future of work during COVID. And then I'm like, it's not about flexibility. It's actually about making work for everyone. Because guess what? 80% of the global workforce can't work from home and have all these RTO discussions because they're in manufacturing plants and retail stores and hospitals, et cetera. And I've shared some of that data in the past. But more recently, I've evolved to this concept of what I'm calling radical employee centricity. And I'll explain it in a minute. And the reason is, I think everything we've talked about to date is a symptom of organizations being broken. And they're not employee-centric nearly enough. And what HR does to the side with a little engagement doesn't really cut it. Because HR can only impact the periphery of work, because HR organizations, even if they have great intent and capabilities, they have no budget and they don't have access to what happens between 9 to 5, 8 to 6, 7 or 7, like whatever the shift is. So let me explain the radical employee centricity, maybe as a framework to think about, everything we talked about today. So my gray hair, I'm old. I started working in the late 80s. And when I learned in the late 80s was it's all about total shareholder return. It's about optimizing for the shareholder. And lo and behold, the best, the largest companies by market cap were brilliant at that. Oil and gas, automotive, industrial conglomerates. Somewhere in the late 90s, really 2000s, people figured out you can't deliver shareholder value unless you deliver customer value. And that's the customer is king era. And who latched on to customer centricity, customer obsession, customer orientation? The emerging tech giants with their, deep, segmentation, personalization, design thinking, customer journeys, right? And we've all been frustrated by how it's easier to get a mortgage than it is to reserve a conference room in our own organizations, right? Because these organizations and using technology to be so customer obsessed. It's Amazon's empty seat at every table, Satya turning around Microsoft with customer obsession. And so we're in this, and look what happened to the largest companies by market cap, those that embrace the customer centricity, and people are trying to catch up. I believe we are on the verge of what I'm calling radical employee centricity, and all the things we talk about, whether it's Gen AI for efficiency and effectiveness, whether it's return to office so I could watch you working, it just is a symptom of work not being designed around employees and treating employees at the same level of customers. And there are so many examples, it's not like nobody's doing it, of companies who do it really well. Costco is a great example. What's the turnover in retail? Probably like 50 to 100% of staff. What is Costco's turnover? 7%. 7%. Imagine the value you could generate if you could, cut your employee turnover to be a fraction of your competitors. Okay. So that's, I think, what's going on here. The next page is, well, what do you do about it? What do you do about it? And these are all the great customer tools that are out there. Deep discovery of customer needs, segmentation, personalization, design thinking. We need to take those customer CX, excellence, functions, experience functions, and we need to turn them towards employees. And we will find, guess what? Surprise, surprise. We are missing the mark. If you just think about, and one of my favorite things is when I do work with clients, the first thing I want to do is send a survey. Oh no, our employees are over-surveyed. You can't possibly survey our people. But guess what? They're not over-surveyed. Just compare the number of customer surveys you get in your life and how many employee surveys you have to fill in your organization. There's a huge gap. Okay, we get too many customer surveys. But the point is, employees aren't tired of filling in employee surveys. They're tired of not seeing any action as a result of filling them in. And so when what I wanted to share in these couple of minutes is, if we were to turn our lenses on our employees, just like we do customers, we will find some amazing things. And we will also find, back to the RTO and the Gen AI discussion, it's not one size fits all. And so having these guardrails that are so prescriptive, I've shown data in some of the early talks here, how the working model has to vary by the type of team and the type of individual. An introvert versus an extrovert need different things to be their best, right? And so I just wanted to share on the next page some really interesting segmentation that came from work I did that we haven't published yet, around rolling out Gen AI. So perfect link, Brian, to your stuff. Like, again, if you go to Starbucks, you'll find 3 types of customers there. I'm making it up. I don't have theirs. But, you know, there are commuters who want their mobile order really quickly. There are locals who want to treat it like a WeWork, get out of the house, get their work done. And then there are regulars that are there to talk to friends. Well, if you treat them like if you make the mobile guy wait as if they want to sit all day, you're going to disappoint your customer. Well, when we were rolling out Gen AI at BCG to our own administrative staff, our executive assistants, we found there are different segments. There are the lifers at the bottom who just want to be an executive assistant forever. They're service oriented. They like to be the magician behind the curtain, right? And we also have launchers that just take the executive assistant job to get a job at BCG. They want to get in, they want this company on their resume, they want to get another job as soon as they can, and they want to use it to learn. And then there are leavers who are here just for the pay and the benefits, and they don't really love the work and they'll leave. But the good news is on the next page, you'll see we have more lifers and launchers than we have leavers. The scale's a little off here in terms of volume, but this is how we define them. And the point of this segmentation is when you roll out Gen AI or you roll out return to office or work model decisions, you have to be radically employee centric and understand that everyone needs different things to enjoy their work and to bring their most and their best every day. Employees are consumers. We make choices how much energy to bring to every interaction, but we are optimizing for different things, and we need to get a lot more sophisticated in our conversations about work models and adopting technology and everything else. All right, that was way too much. Rob, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you. I always learn so much from listening to each of you talk, and I love the range of stuff that we're able to get into. So thank you very much. There's a bunch of questions that have been queued up that are really good ones. So I'm going to pop around and I'll try and direct it to different folks, and we'll hit on as much as we can over the next 20 some odd minutes. I'll start with a question from Matt Boyle, who asked, do we have any sense or can anyone track what percentage of firms announcing a more stringent RTO policy actually cite hard data to support that decision versus the usual platitudes about collaboration and magical water cooler moments? Brian, maybe I'll pass that to you. Do you have a point of view on that?
If Matt doesn't know the answer to that question, I'm not sure how we're going to know the answer to that question. The answer is no, and I don't have data on it. I've read as many of these things, I think, as Matt and all the rest of you have. And the answer in terms of the internal communications, which always get leaked, is there's not data in those. And when employees turn around and ask for data, it's usually not given either. There's at least 1 or 2 examples that I have heard, though. And in those examples, the question is always like, is the office or lack of office actually the core problem? So I'll give you a concrete example. Sales team performance has been slipping, and it's been slipping since the beginning of the pandemic. And therefore, we need to get the sales team back in the office. There may be some actual underlying issues there, meaning if you have junior salespeople who are all working from home that are doing, sales development reps, they're all doing calls, and they're not supported by a manager, and they have no digital support either, meaning they don't have a way to ask each other a question, tap each other on the shoulder, they may indeed be struggling. But the other thing to do is to look at that data and say, is that new or is that a trend line? Because at least for the company I'm thinking about in question, it was a trend line that predated the pandemic. As the company grew, sales job became more and more complex, the bag became bigger, and so therefore the amount of training and specialization needed to become effective got longer, and your time to productive fell. So there may be more than one reason why that data is showing up, but given all that, that's the one example I've got out of a couple hundred of these conversations.
I spoke to someone in Amazon actually about this. So Amazon's the big gorilla in the room, and I had it's a great response by Brian. I was exactly wondering this. Amazon regularly, there are actually a lot of economists that work for Amazon because they're extremely data focused. So several of my colleagues, I've been asked, I don't work for them, I have been asked in the past to wanted to work a day a week. So they're generally very rigorous and look at all the numbers. So I was intrigued on this question, and my friend said, in this case, they did not. So in this case, they didn't ask HR for any analysis. If they looked externally, it's pretty clear the evidence, the research data is that 5-day return to office is not helpful. So there's no external data. You don't. So to the extent they got anything internal, the other issue that I see that I think all of us have been either current or recovering former management consultants, but you're aware that if you're working in a corporate environment and you know the big boss really wants answer X, you generally find answer X. So I can imagine if you know the CEO is desperate to show that return to office is good, you can mince around with the data. So as Brian says, there isn't any data, and to the extent there is, I suspect it's kind of, carefully
It's the
massaged
wrong
not to show that.
data too. They track, brilliant leaders are tracking attendance to measure performance. They're using wrong data and proxies. They're coming to these decisions because people aren't coming in. And performance is bad. They're correlating two things that coexist, but don't relate.
So Debbie, I want to come back to you on that because there's another question. What are companies that are mandating RTO doing to enforce adoption? So out there tracking attendance, what else are you seeing or hearing out there in terms of how folks are specifically putting this into play?
They track attendance. They threaten to use performance management. We'll see at the end of the year if they follow through. But teams are all not complying. So we'll see. I mean, I wrote about mouse jigglers about, right? Like there are all these badge schema going on where people literally will commute, go in, get a cup of coffee, and then go home, right? Because you swipe the badge in, but out you don't swipe your badge. So they'll waste 3 hours, or other people will say, okay, who's taking the badges this week? And people will take the team's badges, a stack of badges, go in, go out, go in, go out, go in, go out, go in, go out. Okay, you get it tomorrow. Managers are telling, I know it's like a deck of cards. Managers are telling their teams, listen, I know it's silly, just go in and go out. So they're doing it with manager compliance too. Like someone's gonna write like the lapse of sanity story in a retrospective a couple of years from now.
I do think that's part of what's driving that reaction too, right? Which is, I think, the reason why to like Mark Ma's data and the Gallup data around like people that are high performers leaving an organization, it's not just they don't feel the trust, it's they lose faith in management. If this is the thing you're focused on, it's a very wasteful set of activities and energies to put people through. And Nick, you've said this before too, like every manager is stuck in the job of saying to people, look, don't quit because I can't afford for you to quit. We'll find a way to work around this. We still have to deliver against our business goals. I've heard stories too about like the HR people that are stuck sitting there tracking individuals' performance. You know, our goal is 50%. We're going to red, yellow, green people on the basis of whether they get in or not. The systems aren't even designed to do that very effectively in the first place. And bluntly, 50% was the corporate average of butts in a seat pre-pandemic. To measure each individual that way is somewhat ridiculous. This is not a good use of time. But at the end of the day, I think most of that enforcement mechanism comes down to an excuse to be able to terminate somebody that you've decided already to terminate anyway, potentially, is the reason why they're doing it. And that's just sort of a sad way to manage people.
The one other thing I'll note on this, and unfortunately I don't have like the permission to share the specific data or like the partner we worked with on this, but we at one point integrated Flex Index data with a large badge system provider just to understand what the average days per week show up rate was relative to policy across a bunch of professional services firms. And we looked at companies that were employees' choice, so no required days in office versus 2 days a week versus 3 days a week. And I think for employees' choice organizations, the average employee was coming in between 1 and 2 days a week. For 2 days a week required, it was like 2.3 days a week. And for 3 days required, it was like 2.5 days a week. So they basically got no incremental power out of moving from 2 days a week to 3 days a week in terms of like relative attendance, like 0.2 days for the actual day required. And I have to imagine that becomes even more compressed if you move toward 4 days a week and 5 days a week in practice. And so to the points being made, I think you run up against really practical constraints on like what people will do or how creative employees will get to get out of, you know, what they don't want to do when pushed to the limit on this. Nick, I want to come back to you on 2 questions related to measurement and performance. One was at the company level, you know, what's a fair time period before the performance of firms that do an RTO mandate, what they should be evaluated. Because there's some period where, for Amazon being an example, they announced in September, I think it goes into effect January, if I recall correctly. And then there's some time upon which then, okay, say, okay, when do you start to say, okay, are they performing better or worse relative to the fact that they did a mandate? Is it immediate, 3 months, 6 months? Like, how do you think about that? And then the other related question was, does anyone have any data on the performance of hybrid remote teams or companies versus RTO mandated ones? I'm curious, Nick, maybe you start there too, and we can kind of like work around on that topic.
Sure. So there's two types of metrics of which the timing's quite different. So one is stock returns. So, new stock returns respond to news. So stock returns, you want to look at the day the announcement's made, and it really tells you what the market thinks on average. So if you take Amazon, I think it was September the 12th, I can't quite remember, but on that day, I noticed that Amazon stock price went down by about 1.5%. So that tells you the market. I mean, other things happened, so it's hard to tell, but on average, the stock market does not reward or does not punish RTO announcements. So traders and the banks, in some senses, that's the best take on the impact of long-run profitability. They just don't move. The other metrics are real metrics in the sense of looking at things like sales, earnings, turnover, etc. The studies have looked as far forward as they can. So, this RTOs in 2021, you have 2 years post data. On average, they don't see anything there. The data I know best is from trip.com, the paper Brian mentioned it earlier, we published in Nature. We basically did an A/B test. We had 800 people that came in 5 days a week, 800 people that came in 3 and worked from home 2, and they're randomized. So they were identical. They're randomized, and even on our birthdays. We had data up to 24 months, which is it's medium term. It's maybe not longest of the long run, but you also look at development, leadership, innovation, promotion metrics, a bunch of stuff. We just didn't see anything. So I think there is a level for certain roles. Like, I'm a professor. If I never came in, it's going to be, teaching is problematic and seminars are problematic. But certainly in the data I've seen, once you're in 2-3 days a week for a job like mine, that's enough. You just don't need to come in all 5 days. And that's pretty clear in the data, and goes back to the Amazon RTO announcement. There is no data I've seen that would support bringing folks back in 5 days a week that can clearly do their jobs effectively working from home 2-3 days a week.
And I would just add in also, like, back to the segmentation, like both based on the work and based on the people, like one model, like what each team needs to be its best. So even the day per week mantra, like maybe a marketing team, and for their work being a couple days a week is great. Maybe a finance team, it's just they're together a couple weeks before the quarter closes. Maybe a technology team that's full of introverts that are writing code and socializing actually hurts their brains and distracts them. For introverts, real introverts. I'm a mother of one. Not all coders. It's best for them to be at home, but it's important to have connections to the office and the culture. So maybe one sprint out of 3 or 4 they do in the office, right? And so this one size fits all thing, and especially like companies like Amazon, right, who are so sophisticated in marketing and understanding their customers, and are so unsophisticated in understanding what even if you didn't care about employee centricity and employee joy, which that's a whole other conversation. But if you cared about what your teams need to be their best and do their best work, to have a one size fits all is so short-sighted.
Yeah.
Brian, I want to come to you on, sorry, go ahead, Brian, if you want to answer this. I had 2 other things for you.
Real quick one. It also, is your team all co-located in the first place, or are they distributed? I mean, there are a lot of Amazon employees who are griping about that one. I'm going to drop a link. There's one other quick study that came out, University of Melbourne, just about a month ago, on stock market returns, actually looking the opposite way, saying what happens with flexible firms. And this is all data that tracks even pre-pandemic. Flexible firms that actually take a more flexible approach, actually outperform in the stock market, and it surprises the stock market. Meaning most people don't think that's a good thing historically, so therefore they surprise the market in terms of how they outperform. They end up being lower cost, higher growth type of organizations. So good news on that front.
Brian, 2 questions I wanted to come back to you on. One was, you recently posted about engagement and how this is worsening. Do you see a correlation with hybrid? And the other was, do you have suggested or favorite metrics that organizations can use to measure trust with their employees?
Yeah, on the first one, the engagement overall drop was literally in the last week or so. Gallup put out a thing saying, yet again, not a big surprise, people are more unhappy at work and more people are looking to quit their jobs and find another employer. That's just like a broad statement of what's going on. I think that has less to do with hybrid work by far than it has to do with the do more with less, pressure for efficiency, layoffs of middle managers, use Gen AI, to get more efficient. Let's see, we can keep on going on, return to office mandates, all the rest of it. What's interesting is if you look at Gallup's data on engagement and you cut it by where people are located, 5 days a week in the office is actually far worse than either fully remote or hybrid in terms of people's engagement with their teams. So this is back to Nick's point. There's no gain in going from 3 or 2 to 5. In fact, there's negative consequences in every single piece of research that's come out. In terms of trust, I'd love to hear other people's answers on that one too. Generally speaking, it's asking the question at a couple of different levels. Do you trust your team? Do you trust your manager? Do you trust senior leadership of your organization to make decisions that are actually right for the business and to be transparent with you about why they made those decisions? So that's the thing you're really trying to get at is, you may or may not agree with the decision, but can you understand the basis of it? It makes all the difference in the world to people. And you may be able to be shielded by your own manager who you do trust for a period of time, but if you don't trust senior leadership, over time, that's going to deteriorate even team level culture.
I want to come to a question that Hadley asked, which I thought was something that resonates with me personally, and then go to Debbie on it. Hadley asked, as mentioned with both Gen AI and managing distributed teams, there is a large need for training and support and a big gap in what is currently being provided to help people be successful with these new ways of working. If a company is open to being more thoughtful about training and tools, where should they start? My personal take is I think, Hadley, this is spot on, and then I'll pass to Debbie. I think that the biggest issue in remote or kind of like more remote friendly organizations is it just requires an orientation toward the process of work and quality and output of work that maybe doesn't get looked at in the same way historically, or there's just not enough rigor put into it and thoughtfulness around what's the timeline in which we're trying to deliver something? How do we check in on that? How do we have professional development conversations remotely? How do we think about getting back on track, giving feedback, a bunch of other stuff? Like the average manager is not very good at that. And they're especially not very good at that in more remote type settings and taking the time to do it. So I actually think this is the heart of the issue in a lot of places is like the lack of quality and capability there. But Debbie, I'll pass to you on this.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It is the point. And so the analogy I use with clients is, remember when you made that decision to move from mainframe to cloud? You didn't just issue a memo and say, we're going to cloud, and that's it. And you would expect it to happen, right? You have to invest in equipment and capabilities and new processes, right? And yet we're completely rewiring how we work, and we're issuing a memo and expecting it to work. I talk about 3 skills that every manager needs to make hybrid work and, that need to be built. The first is actually how to do the norms of the team, how to come up with the team level agreement, or what we call the norms, right? To say, when are we together? When are we apart? Based on the work, based on the team, do the retro at the end of the week. Learn how to optimize for everyone so it's not chaos if everyone do what they want, but the team is doing it together. That's a muscle managers have never needed before. The second muscle they need is how to coach, mentor, inspire, connect with distributed teams. They needed it before. Some were good, some weren't, but now they really need it now, right? And then the third we've talked about is, how do you measure impact, not input or just output? But how do you measure impact? Are you delivering the value, right? As opposed to badge swipes, which is the opposite of that. Those are 3 very new muscles that every manager needs and they don't have. In addition to manager muscles, we need 2 other things. One, we need senior leaders who are role modeling those ways of working. So if senior leaders are saying, I need you in the office a minimum of 2 days a week, they better be saying to themselves, you need to be out of the office a minimum of 3 days a week, right? And the senior leaders have to role model and work the same way, because if they're in the office, everyone is saying, do as you do, not as you say, kind of stuff. And they know they feel like their performance will disappear. And then the third thing you need, in addition to the manager muscles and the leadership role modeling, is you need to align on the communication and collaboration stack. You know, what technologies for what norms, how do you redo office space to get the best use out of it? What do you equip people with at home, and all that kind of stuff? And that is the same investment that, you know, how many like billions did we spend on cloud? And computers all, if you write a code, they all react the same way. Back to segmentation, we're all different. And so building those muscles and those nuances and rewiring our organization, we can't expect it to work if we don't invest.
I think we probably have time for one, maybe two more questions. Nick, I want to come to you with a question that Kate North asked. Any additional movement regarding organizations, commercial real estate teams focusing on creating events with teams and intra-teams versus focused on X days per office? Is that becoming more in vogue, out? Like, what are you seeing trend-wise there?
It's a great point. Yes, you know, I give you what I know so far, which is definitely events have taken off post-pandemic. So for sure, this was really a kind of 22, 23 move onwards, basically, once people started feeling comfortable about getting back together again. The reason why is a lot of particularly, you know, there's two things driving this. One is hybrid. With more people are hybrid or remote, they're meeting less social in the office. And so they're having internal events to meet up with other folks from the same company. So internal events have gone up a lot. I was actually at an Amex global business travel thing 2-3 weeks ago. I have some data actually from the Atlanta Fed on this. You can quite clearly see that event spending, internal event spending is up. The other side of this is external events. There's a feeling when I talk to companies, quite often it comes up that it's harder for us now to meet clients to get business. So if I'm working with Debbie and I'm always say doing it on Zoom, I worry as a professional service firm, I'm not connecting with her and it's going to be harder to sell, you know, a next piece of work. And so external events have also taken up. Interestingly, one way you can see this in the travel expenditure is flight expenditure has kind of gone up the least. So the reason for that is lots of short trips. If I'm going to go work with Brian for an hour meeting, I now just do it on Zoom. Why am I going to bother flying over there and back? But accommodation and particularly the other categories, expenditure has gone up a lot more. So there's like less trips, but they tend to be for longer and they're more in accommodation expenditure. So it has gone up. Whether it's rising through 24 versus 23, I'm less clear. But certainly if you were to have a kind of level, it's pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, it's kind of 2-3x up. So yes, this is one of the big trends is internal and external event expenditure is way up versus 2019.
I feel like I would be remiss if it wouldn't be December 2024 in a way if I didn't ask you to close out with any prognostications for 2025 or anything you're interested in tracking in the new year. So maybe I'll do a quick around the horn and see if anybody has any things that are very top of mind for the next year or things that maybe you'll predictions, things that could look different, anything that's top of mind.
The performance of those who mandate RTO. Maybe the press will start paying attention to those who don't.
Yeah. And those that don't, I mean, I've been talking with a lot of these folks, they're moving on to other problems, right? They're moving on to other actually more important problems. The reason why it's hard to track the stuff back to financial performance or stock performance is it's one of the smallest levers you've got. How you use your time is a much bigger lever than where somebody happens to show up. Whether or not you have a method where you're actually tracking the basis of performance of teams and people and measuring people against that is a much bigger lever than where they're showing up. How you're using and leveraging Gen AI and technologies is a much bigger lever. Like there's so many larger levers than this. You're focused on the wrong problem. It's not going to drive performance. So firms that are actually already past this argument are going to lap those that aren't.
I would guess the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to see a lot of media on the train wreck that's going to be the federal government RTO. So I predict what's going to happen. As you know, that, you know, Musk and Ramaswamy have asked everyone to come in 5 days a week, starting from Jan or Feb next year. I think it will be very hard to do it. There's going to be endless media things about people not coming in, coffee badge swiping, middle managers disagreeing, fighting,
Unions,
lawsuits, all kinds of stuff. So it's going to be very hard to execute. It'll be a mess. It's what I call Swiss cheese policy. It's like full of holes. And B, a lot of top talent is going to quit. And at some point, there's going to be a disaster. Like, I don't know, if you saw the FAFSA form stuff, which is probably minor, but in higher ed, the government just couldn't get the forms online. There'd be some time, I don't know, November 2025, they'll stop paying veterans. because so many people have left. It's such chaos in the federal government. It's just going to melt down, and it's going to, there's going to wait for it. In the next 18 months, there's going to be a government collapse because 40% of people have left. It's chaos. And then it will become so clear that actually this 5-day RTO is causing performance deterioration, not.
There's an HR worry here that everybody should have if you're managing employees, which is regardless of whether it's the RTO demand or just cutting heads, Social Security, Medicare, VA benefits, IRS to help you with your tax forms are all actually important services that are provided to constituents who happen to be your employees. When they can't get those services, the impact on work is going to be a knock-on effect.
Well, thank you all again, Brian, Nick, Debbie. I always learn so much, and you're all phenomenally insightful. So thank you for spending the time together with me. Thank you for everybody who joined us. I hope you have a great rest of 2024. We will send out a link to the webinar and the slides. If we didn't get to your questions, I apologize. Please feel free to ask us offline. We'll do our best to answer, and looking forward to seeing you all again in the new year.
Thanks for
Always
emceeing.
enjoy. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks.
Be well.